Do you affirm the testimony you're about to give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Please be seated and give us your opening statement.
I'm grateful for the opportunity to testify in front of you today. They are a critical reminder of our central mission here at the Department of Justice, protecting the safety and security of the American people.
Okay, so Pam Bondi just experienced what can only be described as one of the most devastating and public legal collapses in recent memory. A former attorney general, longtime Trump loyalist, and someone who spent years positioning herself as a champion of law and order, has now admitted in open court to orchestrating horrific crimes, including evidence destruction, document tampering, and perjury. And a federal judge has responded by immediately revoking her law license, ordering her detention on the spot, and clearing the path toward what could be years in federal prison. Judge Tanya Chutkan, who's presiding over this case, didn't hold back in her ruling, describing Bondi's conduct as conscious, deliberate lies told under oath for the specific purpose of obstructing justice, and making clear that the gravity of this misconduct requires immediate and public consequences rather than allowing Bondi to remain free while awaiting sentencing. We're talking about a situation where Bondi was forced under intense courtroom scrutiny to admit that she removed documents, destroyed evidence, and lied to federal investigators about her role in Trump-related investigations and alleged election interference schemes, and the combination of her own admissions plus overwhelming documentary evidence, including text messages, phone records, and corroborating witness testimony, has created what prosecutors are calling an absolutely airtight case that makes conviction virtually certain and that could result in a lengthy prison sentence that sends a powerful message about accountability for high-level officials who obstruct justice. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us. Be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
Attorney General Pam Bondi has spent the last few hours fielding questions from members of the Senate Judiciary Committee. It's been a tense and confrontational hearing between Bondi and Democratic senators so far. CBS News correspondent Chanel Call has been listening in. Chanel, thank you so much for joining us today. Why is this hearing happening, and what have you heard so far?
Well, hey, Muga, good to see you. So this is an annual Justice Oversight Committee meeting, but it comes after former FBI Director James Comey was indicted by a federal grand jury. So some Democratic lawmakers now accusing the Justice Department of sort of going after people that are perceived to be enemies of President Donald Trump. Attorney General Pamela Bondi, who you see here today, facing some questions about a wide swath of topics, of issues, including her handling of the Epstein files, also the existence of that so-called client list. She was also asked today, Mugo, about the Justice Department hiring January 6ers and the Trump administration's move to deploy National Guard troops to various cities across the country.
Senator, as Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche recently stated, the investigation of Mr. Homan was subjected to a full review by the FBI, agents, and DOJ prosecutors.
The courtroom scene when Bondi was forced to make these admissions was apparently absolutely explosive, with observers describing visible shock on Bondi's face as the judge systematically dismantled her defenses and confronted her with evidence that left no room for continued denial or evasion. According to reports from people who were present, Bondi initially tried to maintain her innocence and claimed that any document handling issues were innocent mistakes or procedural errors. But as Judge Chutkan walked through the specific evidence, including forensic analysis of deleted files, time-stamped communications, showing coordination with others to destroy materials, and witness statements from people who saw Bondi personally removing and destroying documents, it became clear that maintaining her denials would only make things worse. The moment when Bondi finally admitted to the criminal conduct was described as a watershed in the hearing, with audible gasps from spectators and even some of Bondi's own attorneys looking visibly distressed at how completely their client's position had collapsed. For someone who built an entire career on prosecuting others and on public displays of toughness on crime, having to stand in court and admit to being a criminal herself represents not just a legal catastrophe, but a personal and professional humiliation that will define how she's remembered for the rest of her life. Judge Chutkan's decision to immediately revoke Bondi's law license and to order her detention rather than allowing bail pending sentencing shows just how seriously the court views her misconduct and how concerned the judge is about the message that would be sent if someone who obstructed justice at this level were allowed to remain free and continue practicing law while awaiting final punishment. The permanent revocation of a law license is one of the most severe professional sanctions that can be imposed on an attorney. It ends their career, strips away the credential they spent years obtaining, and brands them permanently as someone who violated the ethical standards of the legal profession so egregiously that they can never be trusted to practice law again. The fact that this revocation happened immediately rather than through a lengthy disciplinary process reflects the judge's conclusion that the evidence of Bondi's misconduct is so clear and so serious that there's no point in extended proceedings. The conduct speaks for itself and demands swift action. The detention order is equally significant because judges typically allow defendants to remain free on bail between conviction and sentencing unless they pose a flight risk or a danger to the community. But Judge Chutkan apparently concluded that Bondi's position, her resources, and the severity of her crimes warranted immediate incarceration. The specific admissions that Bondi made about removing and destroying documents and about orchestrating illegal acts as part of Trump's election interference scheme have enormous implications beyond just her personal legal jeopardy, because these admissions potentially provide prosecutors with evidence and leads that could implicate other members of Trump's inner circle who were involved in similar obstruction efforts. When someone at Bondi's level, a former state attorney general who had direct access to sensitive information and who was trusted with coordinating legal strategies, admits to systematic evidence destruction and coordination with others to obstruct investigations, it raises obvious questions about who else was involved, who gave orders for this obstruction, and what information they were so desperate to hide that they were willing to commit serious federal crimes to keep it buried. Prosecutors are apparently telling the court that they may not even need Bondi's cooperation because the evidence they've already gathered is so overwhelming. But if they decide they want her testimony against higher-level figures in exchange for any sentence reduction, Bondi's detailed knowledge of Trump's legal operations and her direct involvement in obstruction efforts could make her an extremely valuable cooperating witness who can provide insider information that external investigation could never uncover. Now let's examine the specific criminal conduct that Bondi admitted to and why each element represents such a serious violation of law and legal ethics that Judge Chutkan felt compelled to impose immediate and severe consequences, because understanding the details makes clear why this case is being treated as such a watershed moment for accountability in Trump-related investigations. Evidence destruction and document tampering in the context of federal investigations are extremely serious crimes because they strike at the heart of the justice system's ability to uncover truth and hold wrongdoers accountable. When people destroy evidence that's relevant to investigations, they're not just trying to protect themselves, they're actively preventing investigators and ultimately juries from being able to make informed decisions about guilt or innocence based on complete information. The specific documents that Bondi admitted to destroying apparently included materials that were directly relevant to investigations into Trump's campaigns and his efforts to overturn election results, which means her obstruction potentially prevented investigators from obtaining evidence of serious crimes, including election interference, conspiracy, and abuse of power. The fact that this wasn't just passive failure to preserve documents, but active destruction, including deleting electronic files, shredding paper documents, and coordinating with others to ensure materials were permanently eliminated, shows criminal intent and consciousness of guilt that makes the conduct far more serious than simple negligence or misunderstanding of document retention obligations. The perjury charges stem from Bondi's sworn statements to investigators where she allegedly lied about her role in document destruction, about what materials existed, and about her knowledge of Trump's activities and directives related to election interference. Perjury is one of the most serious charges that can be brought in the context of investigations because the entire legal system depends on people telling the truth when they're under oath. When witnesses lie under oath, they corrupt the fact-finding process and potentially cause innocent people to be convicted or guilty people to escape justice based on false information. The fact that Bondi, as a former attorney general and experienced prosecutor, knew exactly how serious perjury is and chose to lie anyway, demonstrates either remarkable arrogance or desperate fear about what would happen if she told the truth. Neither of those explanations reflects well on her judgment or character. Judge Chutkan's description of Bondi's lies as conscious and deliberate and for the specific purpose of obstructing justice makes clear that the court doesn't view this as someone who made innocent mistakes or who misunderstood questions, but rather as someone who calculated that lying would serve her interests and who deliberately chose to commit perjury despite knowing it was illegal and despite her professional obligations as an attorney to respect the legal system. The forensic evidence that trapped Bondi and ultimately forced her admissions is particularly damning because it shows that modern investigations have tools to uncover document destruction and cover-ups even when people think they've successfully hidden their tracks. The forensic analysis apparently recovered deleted electronic files from backup servers and from devices that Bondi thought she had wiped clean, revealing not just the content of destroyed documents, but also metadata showing when files were accessed, when they were deleted, and what communications occurred around the time of deletion. This kind of digital forensics has become incredibly sophisticated and makes it much harder for people to successfully destroy electronic evidence without leaving traces that investigators can follow. Bondi apparently didn't understand or didn't believe that deleted files could be recovered, which is a remarkable blind spot for someone in her position who should have known about modern investigative capabilities. The text messages and phone records that corroborate the other evidence show Bondi coordinating with associates about what needed to be destroyed, discussing how to explain away missing documents, and in some cases explicitly acknowledging that what they were doing was illegal but claiming it was necessary to protect Trump and his interests. The witness testimony that supports the documentary evidence came from multiple sources, including former colleagues, subordinates who worked with Bondi, and other individuals who were involved in Trump's legal operations, and who eventually decided to cooperate with investigators rather than face their own criminal liability. These witnesses apparently provided detailed accounts of meetings where Bondi discussed evidence destruction, of specific instructions she gave about which documents needed to be eliminated, and of her statements showing that she understood this conduct was criminal, but felt it was justified by loyalty to Trump or fear of what would happen if certain information became public. When prosecutors have multiple witnesses telling consistent stories that align with forensic evidence and documentary proof, it creates what lawyers call a belt and suspenders case, where even if one type of evidence were challenged or excluded, there would still be more than enough remaining proof to establish guilt beyond reasonable doubt. This is apparently why prosecutors told the court they may not need Bondi's cooperation. They already have such overwhelming evidence from multiple independent sources that they can prove their case without her testimony. Judge Chutkan's immediate detention order reflects several factors, including the seriousness of the crimes, Bondi's access to resources that could facilitate flight, and the need to send a clear message that obstruction of justice at this level will be met with swift and severe consequences. Federal judges have broad discretion in deciding whether defendants should remain free on bail or be detained pending trial or sentencing, and they're supposed to consider factors like flight risk, danger to the community, and the nature and circumstances of the charged offenses. In Bondi's case, the judge apparently concluded that someone with her legal knowledge, her political connections, and her demonstrated willingness to destroy evidence and lie under oath cannot be trusted to comply with bail conditions or to refrain from further obstruction. The fact that Bondi held such a high position as a state attorney general and used that position to facilitate criminal conduct may also have influenced the detention decision, because judges tend to take a particularly dim view of officials who abuse positions of public trust to obstruct justice. When prosecutors and law enforcement officials become criminals themselves, it represents a fundamental betrayal that threatens public confidence in the entire legal system. The precedent-setting nature of this case is being emphasized by legal experts who note that high-level officials have historically often avoided serious consequences for obstruction and perjury, with prosecutions either never being brought or resulting in relatively light sentences that didn't reflect the gravity of the misconduct. Judge Chutkan's aggressive approach to Bondi's case, immediate license revocation, detention without bail, strong language about the need for public consequences, signals that at least some judges are now willing to impose truly meaningful punishment on powerful defendants who obstruct justice, rather than giving them the kid glove treatment that often characterized handling of elite wrongdoers in the past. If Bondi ends up serving a lengthy prison sentence, it will establish a new baseline for how obstruction by high-level officials is punished, and will hopefully deter other people in positions of power from thinking they can get away with destroying evidence and lying to investigators just because they have fancy credentials and political connections. So, what does Bondi's spectacular downfall mean for the broader Trump legal saga and for the question of accountability for people in Trump's orbit who may have engaged in similar obstruction and cover-up efforts, because obviously this case doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of a much larger pattern of investigations into Trump and his associates in their efforts to hide evidence of wrongdoing. The most immediate implication is that prosecutors now have a high-profile conviction and cooperation opportunity that could open doors to evidence about other members of Trump's inner circle who were involved in obstruction schemes. If Bondi decides that cooperating and providing testimony about others is her best path to potentially reducing her sentence, she could become a devastating witness against Trump himself and against other advisors who coordinated evidence destruction and cover-up efforts. Bondi was deeply embedded in Trump's legal operations, attended strategy meetings, had access to privileged communications, and was involved in coordinating responses to various investigations. Her insider knowledge could fill in gaps that prosecutors have been unable to close through external investigation alone, and her testimony under oath about what Trump knew, what he ordered, and what he intended could provide exactly the kind of evidence needed to establish criminal liability for the former president himself. Even if Bondi doesn't cooperate, her case demonstrates that the obstruction and cover-up efforts that were apparently widespread among Trump's associates are now being prosecuted aggressively and are resulting in serious consequences, including prison time and permanent professional destruction. This changes the calculus for other Trump associates who may be facing their own legal jeopardy when they see someone like Bondi, who was so prominent and so connected, ending up in custody and facing years in federal prison. It makes cooperation with prosecutors look much more attractive than fighting charges and hoping for acquittal or light sentences. The cascade effect of one person flipping and providing evidence that leads to more prosecutions, which creates pressure on more people to flip, can accelerate rapidly once the process starts. And Bondi's conviction and immediate detention may be the catalyst that triggers that cascade among Trump's legal team and associates who've been holding out, hoping that loyalty to Trump would somehow protect them. The revocation of Bondi's law license and her admission to criminal conduct also raises questions about what the Florida Bar and other professional organizations knew or should have known about her misconduct, and whether there were warning signs that were ignored or covered up because of her political connections and her association with Trump. Professional regulatory bodies have obligations to investigate allegations of attorney misconduct and to take action when attorneys violate ethical rules or engage in criminal conduct. If there were complaints or concerns about Bondi's behavior that weren't properly investigated or pursued because of her prominence and political influence, that represents a failure of professional self-regulation that needs to be addressed to prevent similar situations in the future. The legal profession's credibility depends on its willingness to police its own members and to impose meaningful discipline when attorneys betray their professional obligations. Bondi's case provides an opportunity to examine whether those disciplinary systems worked properly or whether they were compromised by the same political considerations that led Bondi to obstruct justice in service of Trump's interests. The broader message that this case sends about accountability and the rule of law is potentially transformative if it's followed by similar prosecutions and serious consequences for other high-level officials who've engaged in obstruction and cover-up. For too long, there's been a perception, often justified by actual outcomes, that powerful people with political connections can get away with behavior that would land ordinary citizens in prison because they have resources to hire expensive lawyers, because prosecutors are reluctant to bring controversial cases against prominent defendants, and because the system gives them benefit after benefit in ways that aren't available to regular people. Judge Chutkan's handling of Bondi's case represents a direct challenge to that two-tier justice system. By immediately detaining a former attorney general, by revoking her license without delay, and by making clear that her position and connections won't protect her from the full consequences of her crimes, the judge is demonstrating that meaningful accountability is possible even for elite defendants. If this approach becomes the norm rather than the exception, it could genuinely change how people in power think about the risks of engaging in illegal conduct, because they would no longer be able to assume that their status will shield them from serious punishment. Looking at the specific sentencing range that Bondi likely faces, federal guidelines for obstruction of justice and perjury typically call for significant prison time, especially when the obstruction occurred in connection with serious underlying crimes like election interference and when it was systematic rather than isolated. Sentences of several years are entirely possible and even likely given the aggravating factors in Bondi's case: her abuse of a position of trust as a former attorney general, her coordination with others in the obstruction scheme, her deliberate destruction of evidence, and her perjury under oath all point toward the higher end of applicable sentencing ranges. The fact that she's already been detained pending sentencing suggests the judge views her conduct as warranting substantial incarceration rather than probation or minimal prison time. Judges don't typically detain defendants before sentencing if they're planning to impose lenient sentences, so the detention order itself is a signal that significant prison time is coming. The political implications of Bondi's conviction and imprisonment extend beyond just the Trump legal saga into broader questions about corruption in politics and the weaponization of official positions to serve political rather than public interests. Bondi's trajectory from state attorney general to Trump surrogate to convicted criminal who obstructed justice to protect Trump illustrates how political loyalty and partisan identity can corrupt even people who should know better and who have sworn oaths to uphold the law. The fact that she was willing to throw away her career, her freedom, and her reputation in service of Trump's efforts to hide evidence of wrongdoing tells us something troubling about the hold that Trump has over his associates and about the breakdown of professional norms and ethical constraints that has occurred within segments of the legal and political establishment. Understanding how someone like Bondi ended up making the catastrophic decisions that landed her in federal custody is important for preventing similar corruption in the future and for rebuilding professional standards that prioritize law and ethics over political loyalty. For the American public watching this unfold, Bondi's dramatic fall from former attorney general to convicted criminal in custody represents both a cautionary tale about the consequences of corruption and obstruction and a hopeful sign that accountability is actually possible when judges and prosecutors are willing to do their jobs without fear or favor. The fact that this is happening, that a prominent Trump associate is actually facing serious prison time rather than skating away with a slap on the wrist, challenges the cynicism that many people feel about whether powerful wrongdoers ever really face consequences. At the same time, the fact that it took so long for this accountability to arrive and that it required overwhelming evidence, including Bondi's own admissions, before action was taken, reminds us that the system still has serious deficiencies in how it deals with elite defendants who have resources and connections to resist prosecution. The goal should be to make Bondi's case the beginning of a new era of genuine accountability rather than an isolated exception that makes us feel better while the underlying problems of two-tier justice persist.